So today we're going to be talking about Module 4, Neural and Hormonal Systems. So when we think about kind of what are our neural systems, they're composed of neurons. So we're going to be talking about what neurons are. We're going to talk about more globally the nervous system, and we're also going to be talking about the endocrine system, which is our hormonal system today. So when we talk about kind of the biology of ourself, like what encompasses our personality? Is it our heart, our brain, our whole body? In doing this study historically, you may have heard of the term phrenology. It was developed by Franz Gall in the early 1800s. And he was a fellow, he was kind of a quasi-scientist, and he would go to fairs, and he would kind of interpret people's personalities by feeling the bumps on their skull. And therefore he would make interpretations about their abilities and their characteristics. So you can see on the right, some of the one on top is kind of historically how he talked about it. And so if you found bumps in your head in those different areas, therefore that would correspond to different parts of your personality. He was later kind of thought to be a quack and kind of run out of town. But there was some sense in what he was doing in that, you know, we do have localized characteristics or functions in different parts of our brain. So what phrenology did do was to kind of get us started in this area. So today when we talk about what our personality involves, we generally focus on the brain. So biological psychology includes neuroscience, behavior genetics, neuropsychology, and evolutionary psychology. And all these subspecialties explore different aspects of how the nature of the mind and behavior is rooted in our biological heritage. So when we start talking about kind of how the brain works, the basic kind of the denominator among all of these things is the neuron. It's the smallest kind of atom of the mind. So this is what a neuron looks like. You've probably seen it in your biology classes in high school. So on one end, we have kind of the body of the neuron where the cell is. The dendrites are those tentacle things. The axon is the large part in the middle that's kind of covered in a myelin sheath. That's where the neural impulses go through. And then we have the terminal branches of the axons that kind of release the signal. And so we have millions upon billions of neurons in our bodies, and they're responsible for communicating. Everything we do passes through millions and zillions of neurons every day. So an action potential is a neural impulse that travels down an axon like a wave. So basically it's an electrical signal that goes from the cell body down through the axon into the dendrites, and goes out into then the synaptic space where it's transmitted to the next cell. You can see that there's a large interplay of ions going in and out of the axon toward the terminals. So when does the cell send the action potential? When it reaches a threshold. So basically the neuron receives signals from other neurons, some of which are telling them to fire and some of them telling them not to fire. So then when the critical kind of point is reached, when enough of these signals are reached, the neuron then, the action potential is reached and it starts moving. So it's shooting kind of like a gun. And basically this is known as the all or nothing response. And then the action potential travels down the axon to the terminal branches, and the signal is transmitted to another cell. But it must cross that gap, which is called the synapse. That's the gap between the next neuron. So this is kind of what a synapse looks like, or a synapse. So the synapse is the junction between the axon tip of the sending neuron and the dendrites or cell body of the receiving neuron. So it's the space between the two. And so it also might be known as the synaptic junction or the synaptic gap. So as the action potential is going through the axon to the terminal, neurotransmitters are being released into the synaptic gap, and therefore they are moving to the receptor on the next neurotransmitter. Neurotransmitters are chemicals used to send signals across the synaptic gap. So you can see the little blue dots here are the neurotransmitters, and then they go into receptors on the receiving neuron. So they're kind of released by the sending neuron and received by the receiving neuron. So reuptake is the recycling of neurotransmitters. So once these neurotransmitters are released into the synaptic gap, some of them are, make a match on the subsequent neuron, but then there's ones that are left over, and then they are taken back in by the sending neurons. This is called the reuptake process. So these are kind of all the steps in neural communication seen together. So first we have the electrical impulse, which is called the action potential, which travels down the neuron's axon until it reaches the tiny junction known as the synapse. Then when the action potential reaches the axon terminal, it stimulates the release of neurotransmitters into the synaptic junction, and then they bind to receptors on the next neuron, and this allows electrically charged atoms to enter the receiving neuron and excite or inhibit a new action potential, and then that kind of travels down the next neuron. Then the sending neuron reabsorbs the excess neurotransmitters in a process called reuptake. So that's kind of how the whole neural communication business works. So neurotransmitters play an important role in psychology. So serotonin can affect our mood, hunger, sleep, and arousal. And too little serotonin has been linked to depression, but some antidepressant drugs, like Prozac, can raise serotonin levels. Dopamine can influence movement, learning, attention, and emotion. Too much dopamine has been linked to schizophrenia, and then too little dopamine has been linked to disorders like Parkinson's disease and ADHD. Acetylcholine enables muscle action, learning, and memory. And acetylcholine producing neurons deteriorate as Alzheimer's disease progresses. Norepinephrine helps control our alertness and our arousal. I could probably use some of that right now. An undersupply can depress mood and cause ADHD-like problems. GABA, or gamma-aminobutyric acid, is a major inhibitory neurotransmitter, and too little of it is linked to seizures, tremors, and insomnia. And then glutamate is a major excitatory neurotransmitter, which is also involved in memory, and too much of it can stimulate the brain, causing migraines or seizures. And so therefore, you've probably heard about glutamate and MSG, magnesium monosodium glutamate, and some people avoid that because it gives them headaches. So the serotonin pathways, as we talked about, help regulate mood, and you can see them here on the diagram on the left. The dopamine pathways are involved in focused attention and controlling movement, and you can see them in the diagram on the right. So how do neurotransmitters activate receptors? So basically they fit into one another kind of like keys, and once they do that, they form a signal to the receiving membrane. So this one is a precise fit, and it fits a lot like a lock. So we have various different parts of our nervous system. We have the centralized nervous system, which consists of the brain and the spinal cord, and the central nervous system makes decisions for the body. So that's kind of like the executive functioning. The peripheral nervous system, or the PNS, consists of the rest of the nervous system. So these are kind of the supporting nervous system part that send information to and from the rest of the body. So we have three main types of neurons. We have sensory neurons, motor neurons, and then interneurons. So sensory neurons carry messages in from the body's tissues and sensory receptors to the central nervous system for processing. Motor neurons carry instructions out from the central nervous system to the body's tissue. And interneurons, both in the brain and spinal cord, process the information between the sensory input and motor input. So nerves are not the same thing as neurons, although sometimes we get them confused, but nerves consist of cables that contain many axons. Nerves are part of the peripheral nervous system and connect muscles, glands, and sense organs to the central nervous system. So here you can see the nervous system is composed of the peripheral and the central, which we just talked about. Within the peripheral, we have the autonomic, which controls self-regulated action of internal organs and glands, and the somatic, which is the voluntary movement of skeletal muscles. So those are when we want to move, when our brain tells us to move. Within the autonomic, we have sympathetic and parasympathetic. So sympathetic is our arousing, kind of our fight or flight, and parasympathetic is our calming down. So in the peripheral nervous system, I already went through this: the autonomic, the somatic, and then the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. So the sympathetic arouses our fight or flight reflexes. So our pupils dilate, our heart accelerates, our stomach inhibits digestion because we don't want to be wasting any energy that we need to make an escape. We have our liver stimulates glucose production, therefore it kind of gives us energy. Our adrenal glands stimulate secretion of epinephrine and norepinephrine to give us, more energy and feel more alert. Our bladder becomes relaxed, and in males, ejaculation can be stimulated. The parasympathetic nervous system is the one that calms us down, and it's important for rest and digestion. So the pupils contract, the heartbeat slows, digestion is stimulated, the gallbladder is stimulated, so that's kind of where a lot of things are filtered. The bladder is contracted, and blood is allowed to flow to the sex organs. So if we look at the central nervous system specifically, the brain is a web of neural networks. The spinal cord is full of interneurons that sometimes have a mind of their own. So you can see that they kind of work together, and that's kind of the cool thing about neural networks, is that they form these interconnections among one another. And one of the wonderful things about our bodies is that even if some of these are destroyed, there are times when they can regenerate. Now moving on to the endocrine system, so this is our hormone system, and it refers to a set of glands that produces a chemical messenger called the hormones, or our hormonal system. And there are various organs in our body that are involved with this. So in our brain we have the hypothalamus and pituitary glands. So the hypothalamus is the brain region that controls the pituitary, and the pituitary secretes hormones which can then affect other glands. So in our neck we have the thyroid and parotid glands. So the thyroid affects metabolism, among other things. So you'll often see when people start gaining weight, sometimes they have kind of an underproduction there's something wrong with their thyroid gland, and they have an underproduction of a thyroid hormone. Parotid helps regulate the level of calcium in the blood. Then we have our adrenal glands, and the inner part helps to trigger the fight or flight response, so they're very much important kind of to helping us react. And the pancreas regulates the level of sugar in the blood. And then in the males we have the testes, which secrete male sex hormones, and in the females we have the ovaries, which secrete female sex hormones. So the endocrine message system is significantly slower than the CNS and the PNS, but that's okay. It does send messages like the nervous system, but it sends them through the bloodstream instead of across the synaptic junctions. And as we talked about, these molecules that are sent are called hormones, and they're produced in various glands around the body that we just discussed. And then eventually the messages go to brain and other tissues, and so therefore we can react to some of these things. So the adrenal glands, they are the sympathetic fight or flight nervous system responds to stress by sending a message to the adrenal glands to release epinephrine, adrenaline, noradrenaline, norepinephrine, and cortisol. And all those can kind of spur us into action. They all kind of make us alert, give us energy, etc. And so as a consequence, we see increased heart rate, blood pressure, blood sugar, and it gives us, as I said, the energy to get out of the way. Then in the brain, we have the pituitary gland, which is also known as the master gland of the endocrine system or the hormone system. It's controlled by the nervous system, by the brain area called the hypothalamus, and it produces hormones that regulate other glands like the thyroid. It also produces oxytocin, which helps during sleep, the growth hormone, and oxytocin, which is the bonding hormone between